On the morning of March 14th, 1903, the Volkov family became the last residents to be forcibly removed from what was once called the Lower City. They had lived 3 stories underground for their entire lives. Their great-grandparents had lived there. Their ancestors before them had lived there. And on that morning, when municipal workers finally broke through the sealed entrance, what the Volkovs described seeing for the first time would be documented in a single police report that disappeared from public records within 6 months. This is the story of what they saw, what they said, and why the official narrative about the Lower City doesn't match the evidence that still exists today. If you're interested in uncovering the hidden history they don't teach in textbooks, hit subscribe. I cover suppressed historical accounts every week. Now let's talk about what really happened in 1903. The Lower City wasn't a basement, it wasn't a cellar or a foundation. It was a fully functioning district with streets, buildings and infrastructure that existed beneath what we now call ground level. We know this because of the work of archaeologist Dmitry Antonov, who in 1987 gained unauthorized access to sealed municipal archives in St. Petersburg. What he found were construction documents from 1903 to 1907 detailing something called the Great Levelling Project. These weren't renovation plans, they were burial plans. The documents described the systematic filling of entire city blocks with earth and debris. Streets that had once been at ground level were to be covered with 6 to 9 feet of compacted soil. Buildings were to be filled from the inside, their lower floors packed solid, their windows and doors sealed with brick and mortar. And any remaining residents were to be relocated to newly constructed housing on what would become the new surface level. The Volkov family refused to leave. According to testimony given to a municipal inspector named Grigory Petrov, the family claimed they had nowhere else to go. Their bakery had operated in the Lower City for 4 generations. Their customers lived in the Lower City. Their entire world existed in those underground streets. But by March of 1903, they were the only ones left. Here's what we know about the morning they were removed. At 6:47 a.m., a team of 12 municipal workers arrived at the sealed entrance to what had been Nevsky Prospect Underground, a street that no longer appears on any modern map of St. Petersburg. They used pneumatic drills to break through a brick wall that was 3 feet thick. Behind that wall was a wooden door reinforced with iron bands. Behind that door was a staircase descending 42 steps into darkness. The workers brought oil lanterns. They brought crowbars and sledgehammers. They brought a city magistrate named Viktor Sokolov, who was there to serve an eviction notice that had been issued 9 months earlier. What they didn't bring was any expectation of what they would find. The Volkov family was waiting for them at the bottom of the stairs, not hiding, not cowering, waiting. Dressed in formal clothing that Inspector Petrov would later describe as being from a style popular in the 1840s. There were 7 of them. Yevgeny Volkov, age 64, his wife Anastasia, age 61, their 3 sons, all in their 30s, and 2 grandchildren, both under the age of 10. They were carrying bags. They had been packing for days. They knew this moment was coming. But according to Petrov's report, filed on March 16, 1903, Yevgeny Volkov made a single request before agreeing to leave. He asked the magistrate to look at what they were burying. He asked him to see it before it disappeared forever. What happened next appears in Petrov's report in language that is careful, measured, and disturbingly specific. The Volkov family led the municipal workers and the magistrate through a network of streets that existed entirely underground. These weren't tunnels. They weren't sewers. They were cobblestone streets with sidewalks, lampposts, and buildings that rose 3 and 4 stories high, all of it beneath the surface of what modern St. Petersburg considers ground level. Petrov describes passing a church with stained glass windows that faced not the sky but a vaulted stone ceiling. The altar remained intact. Prayer books sat on wooden pews, open to pages, as if the congregation had simply stood up mid-service and walked away. He describes a marketplace with vendor stalls still stocked with goods that had been abandoned months earlier. Dried meats hung from hooks. Ceramic dishes and metal tools filled wooden crates. He describes residential buildings with ornate facades, carved stone doorways, and architectural details that match the finest structures in the upper city. Some had family crests carved above the entrances, symbols belonging to noble families that no longer existed in official records. But everything was dark, everything was silent, and everything, according to Petrov, felt wrong. The most disturbing part of his report comes when he describes the windows. Every building in the lower city had windows, but those windows didn't face empty air or underground caverns. They faced other buildings across the street, just as windows do in any normal city. The implication was clear. These buildings had not been constructed underground. They had been built at ground level and then buried. The Volkov family brought them to the bakery, a 3-story building with a shop front on what had been the ground floor and living quarters above. The ovens were still intact. The shelves still held bread pans and mixing bowls. The family quarters on the upper floors still contained furniture, clothing, and personal belongings that had accumulated over generations. And on the wall of what Petrov describes as the main living area was a framed photograph showing the bakery as it had looked in 1867. In that photograph, the bakery had windows that showed daylight. The street in front of the building was at ground level, open to the sky. There were no buildings above it. There was no indication that this structure existed underground. The photograph showed a normal city street in a normal European city, but the bakery they were standing in was buried. Yevgeny Volkov told Petrov something that appears in the report verbatim. He said, "My grandfather told me that the sky used to be lower. He said they raised it so the new people would have more room." When Petrov asked what he meant by new people, Volkov replied, "The ones who came after the fires." There is no historical record of any major fire in St. Petersburg between 1840 and 1903 that would explain this statement, but there are records of something else. Between 1897 and 1907, the city government undertook a massive civil engineering project officially described as modernization and expansion. Streets were repaved, buildings were renovated, entire neighborhoods were reconstructed. And according to those same construction documents that Antonov discovered, thousands of tons of fill dirt were brought in to raise the street level across multiple districts. The official explanation is that this was done to prevent flooding. St. Petersburg is built on marshy ground near the Neva River, and raising the street level would theoretically improve drainage and reduce water damage during seasonal floods. But this explanation doesn't account for what happened to the structures that were already there. It doesn't explain why residential buildings would be filled with dirt rather than demolished and rebuilt. It doesn't explain why entire streets would be buried intact rather than excavated and removed. And it definitely doesn't explain the architectural anomaly that appears in Petrov's report. He describes seeing, in multiple buildings, doorways and windows on what should have been the ground floor that were positioned 6 to 8 feet above the floor level inside the building, as if the entrance had once been at street level, and then the street had been raised, and rather than rebuilding the entrance, they had simply filled in the gap and sealed the lower portion of the building. Petrov asked Yevgeny Volkov how his family had survived down there for so long. The response was practical and detailed. They had access to a well that drew from an underground water source. They had stockpiled food purchased before the sealing began. They had oil lamps and candles. They had ventilation shafts that connected to the surface, small openings that brought fresh air down into the buried streets. And they had each other. 7 people living in isolation, maintaining routines that kept them connected to a world that no longer wanted them. But Volkov also said something else. He said they stayed because leaving meant forgetting. He said the people who lived in the lower city remembered things that the people in the upper city had been told to forget. When Petrov asked what things, Volkov gestured to the buildings around them and said, "This, all of this, they want you to believe it was always this way, that the city was built in layers with the old beneath the new, but it wasn't built that way. It was changed that way." Petrov pressed him on this. Volkov's response is recorded in the report with quotation marks. He said, "There was a time when all of this was at street level. When the sun shone on these buildings and people walked these streets under open sky, my grandfather remembered hearing stories about the day that Earth rose, about the day they started building the new city on top of the old one. The Volkov family was relocated to a newly constructed apartment building on Liteyny Prospect. They were given a 4-room unit on the 3rd floor with modern plumbing and gas lighting. They were provided with a small financial settlement to compensate for the loss of their business, and within 2 years every member of the family had either died or disappeared from municipal records. There are no death certificates, no burial records, no forwarding addresses. They simply stop existing in the official documentation of St. Petersburg. The bakery in the lower city was filled with concrete in April of 1903. The streets were sealed and buried by the end of that year, and by 1907 the entire district that had once been known as the lower city no longer appeared on any official city map. It had been erased, not destroyed. Erased. But here's what they couldn't erase. In modern St. Petersburg, there are buildings that have doors and windows that start 8 feet above street level. There are staircases that descend from ground floor entrances and then continue down, far deeper than any normal basement should go. There are ventilation grates in sidewalks that, when you look down into them, reveal architectural features, carved stone, decorative moulding, structural elements that are far too elaborate for a sewer or utility tunnel. On Nevsky Prospect, there's a church with foundations that extend 23 feet below the current street level. During renovation work in 1994, workers discovered that what they thought was the basement was actually the original ground floor, complete with decorated doorways and tiled floors. The building had been half buried and the entrance relocated upward to match the new street level. And there are stories, not official histories, not academic papers, but stories passed down through families who claim their ancestors lived in the lower city. Stories about streets that existed in darkness, about buildings that rose from underground, about a time before the levelling when the city looked different than it does now. In 2004, a construction crew working on a foundation for a new building in the Admiralteisky district broke through into a void space beneath the street. What they found was a vaulted chamber approximately 30 feet wide and 12 feet high. The walls were finished with decorative plaster. The ceiling had moulded cornices, and at one end of the chamber was a bricked-up doorway that, when partially excavated, revealed a continuation of the space beyond. The construction was halted, the void was documented by city engineers, and then it was filled with concrete and paved over. The official report classified it as a collapsed cellar. No further investigation was conducted. Inspector Grigory Petrov's report about the Volkov family evacuation exists in a single archive in St. Petersburg. It's not digitized. It's not catalogued in any public database. It's stored in a box labelled Municipal Housing Disputes 1903 in a records facility that requires special authorization to access. The report is 19 pages long. 12 of those pages describe in methodical detail what Petrov saw in the lower city. The final page includes his recommendation that the district be sealed and that no public record of the evacuation be maintained. That recommendation was followed. The Great Levelling Project was documented as a routine infrastructure improvement. The lower city was never mentioned in official histories of St. Petersburg. And the Volkov family, the last people who lived beneath the streets, disappeared from history as completely as the city they refused to leave. What they saw that morning before they were forced out was a world that wasn't supposed to exist. Streets and buildings and entire neighborhoods that had been buried and forgotten, covered over with earth and lies, and a new version of history that made it all seem normal. They saw the evidence of something that contradicts everything we're taught about how cities develop and evolve. And they tried to make someone remember. Whether you believe their story or not, the physical evidence still exists. You can find it in St. Petersburg today if you know where to look. Doors that lead nowhere, windows that open onto solid earth, ventilation shafts that descend into spaces that shouldn't be there. The lower city is still down there, sealed and buried, waiting beneath the streets of a city that pretends it never existed. This is what the Volkov family saw. This is what they wanted someone to remember. And this is why their story matters, even now, more than a century after they were forced to leave the only world they had ever known. If this kind of suppressed history interests you, I have a video breaking down the architectural evidence of buried cities across Europe. It's linked on screen, and if you want more content like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation. I'll see you in the next one.